There are stories that live in the silence of a woman's heart, stories that nobody sees, nobody hears, nobody suspects, stories that unfold in the soft light of a kitchen at dawn, in the restless nights when sleep refuses to come, in the moments when a woman looks at herself in the mirror and no longer recognizes who she has become. And today I want to tell you one of those stories, a story that begins like so many others, with love, with hope, with a woman who believed she was building a future, but that ends in a place she never imagined, a place where pain becomes clarity, where betrayal becomes power, and where a woman discovers that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that finally set us free. Her name was Elena. She was 34 years old when everything happened, and if you had seen her walking down the street with her daughter Sophia, you would have thought she was just another woman, another mother, another wife. You would have seen her smile, you would have heard her laugh, you would have watched her organize her life with that quiet efficiency that so many women master. But what you wouldn't have seen, what nobody saw, was the weight she carried inside, the questions that kept her awake at night, the growing sense that something in her marriage, something in her life, was profoundly wrong, and yet she couldn't name it, couldn't touch it, couldn't prove it, because betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that changes everything, doesn't always announce itself with screams or scandals. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in small inconsistencies, in the feeling that the man sleeping beside you is a stranger wearing a familiar face. Elena had been married to David for 12 years. They met in university. He was studying business, she was finishing her degree in education, and their love story was the kind that everyone envied. He was charming, ambitious, attentive. He brought her flowers without reason. He planned surprises. He made her feel like the center of his universe. And when they married, Elena believed she had found her home, her partner, the father of her future children. They bought a small apartment, they painted the walls together, they talked about their dreams late into the night, and when Sophia was born 3 years into their marriage, Elena felt her life was complete, perfect, exactly as she had imagined it would be. But life, as you know, rarely follows our scripts, and somewhere between Sophia's birth and her 10th birthday, something shifted. David's business began to grow. He traveled more, stayed late at the office more, came home exhausted more, and Elena, like so many women, absorbed these changes as natural, as necessary, as the price of building a secure future. She told herself that marriage evolved, that passion transformed into partnership, that her role now was to hold the home together while he held their finances together, and so she did. She became the invisible architect of their daily life. She managed Sophia's school, the household, the meals, the appointments, the emotional labor that nobody names but everyone depends on, and slowly, so slowly she didn't even notice, Elena began to disappear. What nobody tells women, what we rarely discuss, is how the nervous system responds to chronic emotional neglect, how the amygdala, that ancient part of our brain designed to detect danger, begins to fire differently when we live in a constant state of uncertainty, when we sense something is wrong but have no concrete evidence, when we feel ourselves shrinking but don't understand why. Elena's body knew before her mind did. She started having trouble sleeping. Her stomach hurt for no apparent reason. She felt anxious in ways she couldn't explain, and at night, lying beside David while he slept peacefully, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder if this emptiness, this loneliness inside a marriage, was just what adult life felt like, or if she was losing something essential, something she couldn't afford to lose. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Elena was cleaning David's study, something she rarely did because he preferred to keep that space private, but Sophia had accidentally thrown a ball through the window and Elena needed to measure for a replacement, and while she was there, while she was moving papers and books, she found a folder tucked behind a stack of magazines. Inside were medical documents, bills, appointment records, and as Elena read them, as her eyes moved across the words, her hands began to shake, because what she was holding, what she was reading, was proof that David had undergone a vasectomy 2 years earlier, a permanent sterilization, a decision that affected both of them, a choice that eliminated her ability to have more children, and he had never told her, never asked her, never even suggested they discuss it. Elena sat on the floor of that study for over an hour, the papers scattered around her, her mind trying to process what this meant. And I want you to understand something about this moment, about what happens in a woman's brain when betrayal is revealed, because this wasn't just about a medical procedure. This was about agency, about partnership, about the fundamental agreement that two people make when they promise to build a life together. Elena had spent the last year telling David she wanted another child. She had been tracking her cycle, taking vitamins, hoping, waiting, and all that time, all those months of hope and disappointment. He had known it was impossible. He had watched her hope and done nothing, said nothing, let her believe the problem might be hers, let her wonder if her body was failing, and this particular cruelty, this erasure of her reproductive autonomy, was something Elena's mind couldn't immediately accept. When David came home that evening, Elena was sitting at the kitchen table, the folder in front of her, her face calm in that terrifying way that comes before a storm, and when he saw what she was holding, when he understood what she had discovered, something flickered across his face, fear maybe, or calculation, but not remorse, not the immediate horror of someone who realizes they've caused deep pain. Instead he sat down. He looked at her, and he said, I did it for us, for our family, we couldn't afford another child, you know that, I made the responsible choice, and Elena, who had spent 12 years learning to doubt herself, who had been trained by love and marriage to prioritize his perspective over her own, almost believed him, almost accepted this explanation, almost let him rewrite reality again. But something in her, something deep and ancient and utterly female, refused, because there's a difference between making a choice together and making a choice for someone. There's a difference between partnership and control, and what David had done, whether he understood it or not, was erase her voice from a decision that belonged to both of them. He had treated her not as an equal but as someone whose desires, whose body, whose future could be managed without consultation, and as Elena sat there, as she watched him justify, explain, rationalize, she felt something break inside her, not her heart, that had been breaking slowly for years, but something else, some final thread of belief in the story she had been telling herself about who they were. I need you to understand something about love and control, about how they can become so entangled that we can no longer tell them apart, because David probably did believe he loved Elena, he probably thought his actions were protective, responsible, even noble, but love, real love, doesn't make permanent decisions about someone else's body without their knowledge. Love doesn't watch someone suffer and remain silent. Love doesn't prioritize control over communication, and what Elena was beginning to see, what was finally becoming clear through her shock and pain, was that somewhere in their marriage, she had stopped being a partner and had become something else, a role, a function, someone whose purpose was to support his life without questioning it. The next few weeks were strange. Elena moved through her days like a ghost. She took Sophia to school, she made dinner, she went to bed beside David, but inside she was somewhere else, somewhere dark and questioning, turning over memories like stones, looking for patterns she had missed, and slowly, piece by piece, other things began to make sense. The way David had discouraged her from working after Sophia was born, saying they didn't need the money, that Sophia needed her home, the way he managed all their finances, never quite explaining where the money went, always vague about their savings. The way he had convinced her to sell the small apartment her grandmother had left her, saying they needed the money for a better house, a house they never bought, and Elena began to realize that the vasectomy wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern, a systematic removal of her independence, her voice, her power. One morning, unable to sleep, Elena did something she had never done before. She opened David's laptop. She knew his password because he had never bothered to hide it, never imagined she would look, and what she found, what she discovered in his emails and messages, was a second life, complete and detailed and absolutely devastating. There was a woman named Valeria, she was 26, she worked in marketing, and she and David had been involved for over 3 years. There were messages about trips they took when he claimed to be traveling for work, there were photos from restaurants Elena had never been to, there were conversations about their future, about how much he wished he could leave his marriage but couldn't because of Sophia, because of finances, because of what people would think. But it was the financial records that truly shattered Elena, because buried in the emails were statements, invoices, transfers, and what she saw there made her stomach turn. David had been transferring money, significant amounts, regularly, to accounts she didn't recognize. He had been maintaining an apartment for Valeria, paying for her car, her credit cards, even investing in a small business she wanted to start. And all of this, all of these thousands of dollars, came from their accounts. From the money Elena had contributed before she stopped working, from the sale of her grandmother's apartment, from their joint savings, he had been using their resources, her resources, to build a life with another woman, and Elena, who had worried about spending money on herself, who had made their home as affordable as possible, who had sacrificed so her family could thrive, realized she had been funding her own betrayal. What happens in a woman's brain when she discovers this kind of comprehensive deception is extraordinary. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thought and planning, can temporarily shut down, overwhelmed by the flood of stress hormones. Cortisol and adrenaline surge through the system, the heart rate spikes, the body prepares for fight or flight. But here's what's fascinating. Here's what the research shows us. After that initial shock, after those first terrible hours or days, something else can happen. The brain can shift into a state of remarkable clarity, hyperfocus some researchers call it, where suddenly patterns are visible that were invisible before, where information arranges itself into coherent narratives, where a woman who felt confused and uncertain suddenly sees everything, understands everything, and knows exactly what must be done. Elena entered that state. She didn't cry, she didn't confront David immediately. Instead, she began to document. She made copies of every email, every financial record, every message, every piece of evidence of his double life. She opened a separate bank account David didn't know about. She found all their important documents, marriage certificate, property records, tax returns. She photographed everything. She organized everything, and she began to construct a plan, because Elena understood something crucial, something every woman in her position needs to understand. In situations of betrayal this deep, this calculated, emotional reactions can be dangerous. They can lead to decisions made from pain rather than strategy. They can put you in vulnerable positions. And Elena, who had been underestimated her entire marriage, who had been treated as simple, manageable, cooperative, decided she would no longer be any of those things. Let me tell you about another woman. Her name was Carmen. She lived in Madrid. She was 41 when she discovered her husband had not only been unfaithful but had systematically stolen from their business, a restaurant they had built together over 15 years. He had been skimming money, hiding income, accumulating debt in her name. And when Carmen discovered this, her first instinct was to confront him publicly, to explode, to make sure everyone knew what he had done. But a friend, a lawyer, pulled her aside and said something that changed everything. She said, "Carmen, rage is valid, rage is understandable, but rage used too soon is wasted. Right now you have information he doesn't know you have. Right now you have the advantage. Use it. Protect yourself first, get angry later." And Carmen listened. She spent 3 months quietly securing evidence, protecting her assets, consulting experts. And when she finally confronted him, when she finally showed him what she knew, she did it from a position of power, not vulnerability. She didn't scream or beg or ask why. She simply presented the facts and the consequences, and that strategic clarity born from pain, was what saved her. Elena thought about Carmen. She thought about all the women who had been betrayed and then made poor decisions from trauma, who had confronted too soon, who had trusted that surely their partner would be honest now, would be fair now, would recognize the harm they had caused. But Elena knew better. She knew that David, the man who could watch her hope for a child while knowing it was impossible, the man who could spend her inheritance on his mistress, was not suddenly going to become honest or fair. She knew that people don't change their character in moments of exposure, they reveal it. And so she waited, she planned, she prepared. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Through her documentation, Elena discovered that Valeria, David's mistress, came from a wealthy family. Her father owned a successful import company, and more importantly, Valeria herself had inherited money from her grandfather. This was mentioned casually in messages, references to her trust fund, to investments she was managing, to her financial independence. And Elena began to wonder, began to research, began to understand something that would change everything. Valeria had money, real money, and David, in his arrogance, in his certainty that his worlds would never collide, had been careless about this. He had mixed their finances. There were transfers from Valeria to accounts he controlled. There were investments they had made together. There was a paper trail. Elena sat with this information for days, turning it over in her mind. And then one morning, she did something bold. She created a fake email account. She crafted a message carefully, professionally, and she sent it to Valeria. She wrote, "I am a financial consultant investigating irregularities in several accounts associated with David Moreno. I believe you may be a victim of financial fraud and would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this with you confidentially. Your cooperation could protect your assets and prevent further losses. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." And Elena, who had never done anything remotely like this before, who had lived her life following rules, being good, being cooperative, hit send. Valeria responded within hours. She was nervous, confused, and yes, willing to meet. They arranged to meet at a cafe in a neighborhood neither of them frequented, and when Elena walked in, when she saw this young woman sitting at a corner table, looking anxious and elegant and so very young. She felt something unexpected, not hatred, not even anger, but a strange kind of recognition, because Valeria, she realized, was also a victim, perhaps a willing one, perhaps a naive one, but a victim nonetheless of David's elaborate constructions. Elena sat down, she introduced herself with a false name, and she began to ask questions, professional questions about Valeria's financial transactions with David, about the business he had convinced her to invest in, about the apartment she thought they co-owned, about the various ways he had positioned himself in her financial life. And as they talked, as Valeria answered, sometimes defensive, sometimes worried, Elena began to see the full picture of David's deception. He had told Valeria he was separated, nearly divorced, waiting only for the right moment to make it official. He had convinced her to invest in businesses that didn't quite exist, to co-sign for properties that were actually in his name alone, to lend him money for emergencies that never happened, and Valeria, young and in love and trusting, had done it all, had given him access to her accounts, her credit, her trust fund, never suspecting that the man who held her at night was someone else entirely. Here's what's important about this moment, about what Elena did next. She could have exposed David to Valeria right then, could have revealed everything, could have watched this young woman's world collapse with the same cruelty hers had, but she didn't. Instead she said, "I need to be honest with you about who I am. I'm not a financial consultant. I'm David's wife, his actual wife. We're not separated. We live together. We sleep in the same bed. Our daughter just turned 10, and everything he's told you about our marriage, about his life, is a lie, and I'm here because I've discovered he's been stealing from both of us, using our money, our resources, our trust, to build a life that serves only him, and I believe, we can help each other." The silence that followed was profound. Valeria's face went through a series of expressions: shock, denial, anger, recognition, grief, all in the space of seconds, and then, to Elena's surprise, to her relief, Valeria began to cry, not the dramatic tears of a mistress caught, but the deep, wounded tears of a woman who had just realized she had been used, that the love she believed in was fiction, that she too had been erased, managed, controlled, and Elena, who had every reason to hate this woman, found instead that she couldn't, because they were both, in different ways, casualties of the same man's selfishness. They talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Elena showed Valeria the evidence she had collected, the financial records, the messages to other women. Yes, there were others, brief affairs, online relationships, a pattern that went back years, and Valeria, in return, shared her own evidence, bank statements showing money she had given David, contracts for investments that never materialized, messages where he promised marriage, children, a future, everything Elena had once believed in too. And as they compared notes, as they built a complete picture of David's double life, they began to formulate a plan. What Elena understood, what she explained to Valeria, was that David's greatest vulnerability was his arrogance. He believed himself clever, careful, protected by the separate compartments he had created. He believed Elena was too naive to discover his deception, too dependent to leave, too weak to fight back, and he believed Valeria was too infatuated to question him, too young to see through his manipulations, too trusting to protect herself, and this certainty, this absolute confidence in his own superior intelligence, was what would destroy him. The plan they created was elegant in its simplicity. Valeria would continue her relationship with David as if nothing had changed, but she would start asking different questions, questions about their investments, about when certain returns were due, about documentation he had promised. She would create pressure, nothing aggressive, just the gentle, persistent pressure of someone who wants clarity about their financial future. Meanwhile, Elena would continue to document, to gather evidence, and, most importantly, she would quietly begin to separate their finances, to protect what remained of her assets, to prepare for what was coming. But the crucial element, the piece that would make everything work, was this: Valeria would slowly, carefully, begin to withdraw her support, financial and emotional. She would become less available, more questioning, more demanding of proof, of progress, of the future David had promised. And Elena knew, she understood from 12 years of marriage, that David needed validation, needed to be admired, needed to feel like the hero of his own story. And when that started to crumble, when Valeria stopped providing that reflection, he would panic, he would make mistakes, he would reveal himself even more completely. Let me tell you about the nervous system's response to prolonged deception, about what happens to someone who lives in multiple realities simultaneously. maintaining different versions of themselves for different audiences, because David, whether he knew it or not, was living in a constant state of stress, his cortisol levels chronically elevated, his prefrontal cortex working overtime to keep track of his lies, to maintain his various performances, and this kind of cognitive load, this perpetual juggling act, creates vulnerability. People make mistakes when they're stressed, they forget details, they contradict themselves, they become reactive rather than strategic, and Elena and Valeria were counting on this. They were creating conditions that would increase David's stress, that would force him into mistakes. The first crack appeared 3 weeks into their plan. David came home frustrated, complaining that Valeria was being difficult about money, questioning investments, asking for documentation, acting, he said with genuine bewilderment, like she didn't trust him, and Elena, playing her role perfectly, sympathized, said how terrible it was when people questioned your integrity, asked if maybe the stress of his work was affecting his relationship, and David, needing comfort, needing someone to validate his perspective, told her more than he intended, about how much money he had put into Valeria's business, how he expected returns that weren't materializing, how ungrateful she was being, and Elena listened, nodded, recorded everything, because David had forgotten the first rule of maintaining separate lives. You never complain about one woman to another, you never blur those carefully constructed boundaries. As weeks became months, as the pressure increased, David began to unravel in small but visible ways. He became irritable, distracted, he made mistakes at work, he started drinking more, and Elena watched all of this with a strange detachment, because the man she was observing was someone she no longer knew, or perhaps someone she was finally seeing clearly for the first time, not the charming student she fell in love with, not the ambitious businessman she admired, not the father she wanted Sophia to respect, but someone smaller, weaker, someone whose entire identity was built on control and deception, and who was crumbling without it. The end, when it came, was both dramatic and inevitable. Valeria, following the plan, told David she wanted to end their relationship, that she had met someone else, someone available, someone honest, and David, predictable in his narcissism, became desperate. He offered more promises, more investments, more future, and when she remained firm, when she said she wanted her money back, the money she had invested in their various ventures, he became angry, threatening, and this was exactly what Elena had been waiting for, because Valeria recorded everything, every threat, every manipulation, every glimpse of the rage that lives behind a charming smile. That evening, David came home in a state Elena had never seen before, wild, barely contained, and he started talking, started confessing, not because he wanted to but because he couldn't hold it anymore. He told Elena about Valeria, framing it as a mistake, a brief affair that meant nothing, claiming Valeria was obsessed with him, was threatening him, demanding money she had no right to, and Elena listened, her face calm, her voice steady, and when he finished, when he looked at her expecting shock or tears or anger, she said simply, I know, I've known for months, I know about Valeria, I know about the others, I know about the vasectomy, I know about the money, I know everything. The silence that followed was absolute. David's face went through the same progression Valeria's had months before, shock, denial, calculation, and then something else, something hard and cold, and he said, you can't prove anything, whatever you think you know, you can't prove it, and I have the accounts, I have the business, I have the lawyers, if you try to leave me, you'll get nothing, you'll lose everything, and Elena smiled, actually smiled, and said, that's where you're wrong, I can prove all of it. I have emails, financial records, recordings, messages, I have enough evidence to ensure you lose not just our marriage but your business, your reputation, your freedom, and more than that, Valeria and I, we've been working together, we've documented your fraud, your threats, your systematic theft from both of us, and we've already filed reports with the Financial Crimes Unit, with the tax authorities, with everyone who needs to know. What happened next unfolded over months. David tried to fight, hired lawyers, made counter-accusations, tried to paint Elena as mentally unstable, tried to discredit Valeria as a vindictive ex-lover, but the evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was thorough, and more importantly, Elena had something David never anticipated. She had support, not just from Valeria, but from other women who came forward once the story became known, women David had deceived, manipulated, taken money from. Over the years, each with their own pieces of the puzzle, each confirming the pattern Elena had uncovered. The legal process was exhausting, painful. There were days Elena wanted to give up, to settle, to just walk away, But she thought about Sophia, about what she was teaching her daughter by fighting, about the message she would send if she let David's betrayal go unpunished, and she continued, and Valeria continued beside her, these two women who had started as adversaries and became allies, united not by hatred of the man who betrayed them but by commitment to their own dignity, to the truth, to the principle that you cannot systematically erase women and expect no consequences. In the end, David lost almost everything. The divorce settlement awarded Elena significant assets, recognition of the money he had stolen and hidden, custody arrangements that prioritized Sophia's well-being over his convenience, and separately, Valeria won a civil judgment recovering her investments plus damages. But more than the financial victory, more than the legal vindication, what mattered was something else. Elena had reclaimed her voice, her agency, her sense of self. She had transformed from a woman who doubted her own reality into someone who trusted herself completely, who understood that love should never require you to disappear, who knew that partnership means sharing power, not surrendering it. I want to tell you what happened to Elena after, because endings matter, transformations matter. She didn't immediately feel healed, didn't wake up one day magically whole. Trauma doesn't work that way. Betrayal leaves wounds that take time to close, and Elena spent months in therapy, working through not just David's deception but her own participation in it, understanding how she had learned to silence herself, how she had been taught that women's desires are negotiable, how she had absorbed messages about sacrifice and service that left no room for her own needs. She discovered that her childhood had prepared her for David in ways she never realized. Her father had been controlling, her mother compliant, and Elena had learned early that love meant accommodation, that conflict was dangerous, that her job was to keep peace rather than demand respect, and unlearning these patterns, rebuilding her sense of self, was harder than any legal battle, more painful than any betrayal, because it required Elena to grieve not just her marriage but the version of herself she had been, the good girl, the easy partner, the woman who never made trouble. Sophia, now 11, asked questions Elena answered honestly, age-appropriately but truthfully. She explained that sometimes people we love disappoint us, that adults make mistakes, that families change shape but love continues, and Elena was careful never to villainize David to their daughter, never to use Sophia as a weapon, because she understood that whatever David had done to her, he was still Sophia's father, and children need to form their own relationships, their own understandings, their own conclusions. Valeria and Elena remained friends, not close, not daily, but connected by what they had survived together. They would meet for coffee occasionally, check in on each other's progress, share the small victories and setbacks of rebuilding life, and there was something profound about this friendship, about two women who had every reason to hate each other choosing instead to recognize their shared humanity, their shared strength, their shared survival. 2 years after everything ended, Elena did something she never expected. She went back to school, finished her teaching degree, got a job at a local elementary school, and discovered that working with children, helping them learn, watching them grow, gave her a sense of purpose she had been missing for years. She was good at it, patient and creative and genuinely engaged, and her students loved her, sensed in her that quality all great teachers have, the ability to see them completely, to believe in who they could become. She also, tentatively, carefully, began to date again, not seriously at first, just coffee with a colleague, dinner with a friend of a friend, slowly learning to trust again, to be vulnerable again, to believe that partnership could exist without control, that love could be safe, and it was terrifying and awkward and sometimes disappointing, but it was also, gradually, healing, proof that David's betrayal hadn't broken something essential in her, that she could still hope, still feel, still imagine a future that included companionship and joy. What neuroscience teaches us about healing from betrayal is fascinating. The brain's plasticity, its ability to form new neural pathways, means that we're never trapped by our past. Trauma creates patterns, yes, responses we learn to keep ourselves safe, but with time and intention and support, we can create new patterns, healthier responses, different stories. The amygdala can learn that not all relationships are dangerous. The prefrontal cortex can rebuild trust in our own judgment. The nervous system can regulate itself again, and Elena experienced this, felt it happening in her body, the way her stomach stopped hurting, the way she slept through the night again, the way she could think about the future without panic. Let me tell you about one more woman. Her name was Patricia. She was 53 when her husband's affair was exposed, and unlike Elena, Patricia had no interest in fighting, in pursuing justice, in making him pay. She just wanted it over, wanted to move on, wanted to pretend it never happened, and so she accepted a minimal settlement, told no one what really happened, absorbed the shame and the pain privately. And 5 years later, when I met Patricia, she was still angry, still bitter, still obsessed with what had happened, because here's the truth about betrayal, about trauma: you can't outrun it. You can't ignore it away, you can only move through it, process it, metabolize it, transform it into something else. And Patricia, in her attempt to avoid the pain, had only prolonged it, had sentenced herself to carry it forever. Elena chose differently. She faced everything, felt everything, fought for everything, and yes, it was harder initially, more painful, more public, but it was also complete. It had an ending, a resolution, a transformation. And this is what I want you to understand about healing: it's not about avoiding pain, it's about moving through it consciously, purposefully, with support and intention. It's about refusing to let betrayal become your identity while also refusing to pretend it didn't matter. On Sophia's 12th birthday, Elena threw a party in their new apartment, smaller than the house she had shared with David but entirely hers, filled with light and plants and photos of places she wanted to travel. And as she watched Sophia laugh with her friends, as she felt the warmth of chosen family around her, she realized something profound. She had lost a marriage, yes, had been betrayed in ways that nearly destroyed her, but she had gained something more valuable: she had gained herself. Her voice, her power, her unshakable knowledge that she could survive anything, could rebuild from nothing, could transform pain into purpose. The story I've told you today isn't really about revenge, though that word will tempt you, will seem to describe what Elena did, but revenge is empty, destructive, focused on harming the other person. What Elena pursued was justice, accountability, the restoration of what was stolen, the protection of her future, and yes, the satisfaction of showing a man who underestimated her exactly what she was capable of. But more than anything, this story is about reclamation, about a woman who was erased, learning to make herself visible again, who was silenced learning to speak her truth again, who was controlled learning to trust her own judgment again. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, if you're in a relationship where you feel yourself disappearing, where your reality is constantly questioned, where your partner makes significant decisions without you, please hear this: it's not normal, it's not love, it's not how partnerships work. Love should make you more yourself, not less. Love should expand your world, not contract it. Love should feel safe, not confusing. And if the person you're with tells you they love you while consistently disrespecting your boundaries, dismissing your feelings, controlling your choices, they're not describing love, they're describing ownership, and you deserve better. Here's what I want you to remember from Elena's story. First, trust yourself. If something feels wrong, if your body is telling you something is wrong even when you can't prove it yet, listen. Your nervous system is ancient and wise. It detects patterns before your conscious mind can name them. Second, document everything. In situations of deception, evidence is protection. Keep records, save messages, maintain your own accounts. Knowledge is power. Third, find your people, your support system. Whether that's a friend, a therapist, a support group, you cannot heal alone. Trauma thrives in isolation. Healing requires connection. Fourth, take your time. Don't make permanent decisions from temporary emotions. Rage is valid but strategy is powerful. Protect yourself first, react later. And finally, understand that healing is possible, that you can recover from even the deepest betrayal, that your story doesn't end with someone else's cruelty. It begins after it, when you decide who you will become now, how you will rebuild, what you will create from these ruins. Elena's daughter Sophia is 14 now. She's strong and opinionated and learning early what her mother learned late, that women's voices matter, that boundaries are healthy, that love should never cost you yourself. And sometimes Elena looks at her daughter and feels grateful, not for the betrayal, never that, but for what it taught her, for what it forced her to become, for the woman she had to discover she was in order to survive. There's a moment Elena remembers from the worst days, when everything was falling apart, when she wasn't sure she could continue. She was driving home from a lawyer's meeting, exhausted and overwhelmed, and she stopped at a red light next to a playground, and she watched a little girl, maybe 6 years old, climb to the top of the tallest slide, hesitate for a moment at the top, afraid of the drop, and then push off anyway, flying down with her arms raised, laughing, fearless. And something about that image, about that courage, about that willingness to feel fear and move forward anyway, broke something open in Elena, and she cried there in her car. Cried for the little girl she had been, for the woman she had become, for the fear she was feeling, and for the courage she was about to find. That's what this story is really about finding courage you didn't know you had, about discovering that you're stronger than you believed, about learning that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you becomes the catalyst for becoming who you were always meant to be. Elena didn't want her story, didn't choose this path, would have preferred a different journey, but this was the journey she got, and she walked it with grace and strength and determination, and she emerged transformed, and now she helps other women walk their own paths, teaches Sophia how to walk hers, and lives each day as proof that betrayal doesn't have to destroy you. It can, if you let it, remake you. So here's my question for you. If you're in a situation that's stealing your peace, your voice, your sense of self, what are you waiting for? What permission do you need that you haven't given yourself? What fear is bigger than the cost of staying? Because here's what I know. Here's what Elena learned. Here's what every woman who survives and transforms knows. You are capable of more than you imagine. You are stronger than you believe. You deserve better than you've been told, and the life you want, the one where you feel whole and safe and seen, is possible. It's waiting. It requires courage and support and time. But it's there, and you can reach it, you can claim it, you can become it. Elena did, and her story, painful as it was, devastating as it was, became the story that saved her. Because sometimes the ending you don't want becomes the beginning you need, sometimes loss becomes discovery, sometimes betrayal becomes liberation, and sometimes the woman you were forced to become is exactly the woman you were always supposed to be. You just needed something terrible to introduce you to her, to show you what she was capable of, to prove that she could survive anything, and now she knows. Now you know. Now we all know that women are not the fragile creatures we've been told we are. We are survivors, warriors, transformers of pain into power. And no matter what story brought you here today, no matter what betrayal you're facing or have faced or fear facing, remember Elena, remember her strength, her strategy, her transformation, and remember that her story, impossible as it seemed, is also yours, waiting to be written, waiting to be lived, waiting for you to claim it.